Hi everyone, welcome to our impromptu virtual lecture for chapter 3. This is a super foundational chapter, so please make sure you pay attention to this and your textbook. I really like this quote. Walt Whitman said that you contain multitudes. And this can mean lots of things to lots of different people, but for me, it really means that ourselves are so exceptionally complicated, and then you add ourselves to other people who are also exceptionally complicated, and this creates this interconnectedness that creates our reality. Understanding yourself is foundational to understanding how it is that you can be in and relate to other people around you. So we're going to talk a lot about this notion of self-concept. And self-concept is sort of how you feel about yourself and who you are as a person. If I asked you to list 10 or 15 things about you, these things would often make up your self-concept. They are extremely multifaceted. It's yourself as a bunch of smaller selves because you're different in different relationships and you play different roles and you have different characteristics and attributes, and those are both changing and sort of the same throughout all of your relationships. And of course, our self-concept is subjective, meaning that we decide what is and is not part of our self-concept. And those are not always objective facts. And I really like this notion that it is enduring but changeable. Some of the research that I do talks about things that happen in our lives that change our identity and our self-concept. And for me, one of the biggest things that changed my self-concept was becoming a mother. When I had Elias, my self-concept completely changed. I stopped being as good of an academic as I was because parenting is difficult and having a newborn is difficult. And it caused me to struggle in academia where I had not struggled before. And so where there were many, many things about me that were very constant, the change from not mother to mother was a huge identity shift. And a lot of y'all are going to be going through a similar change. Going from high school to college is a big transition in your life, and lots of your self-concepts may change during this time. I really like the notion of reflected appraisal, which is how we think other people see us. And how we think other people see us affects how we see ourselves and how we communicate with other people. If you assume that other people see you as intelligent or competent or confident, then that's going to affect how you see yourself and how you communicate with other people. The exact opposite is sort of the same too, or relevant too. If you think that other people see you as unworthy or needy, or a burden, then that's also going to change how you see yourself and how you communicate with within that relationship. The other thing that I kind of like about this is the notion of social comparison. And I know we've probably all seen the memes and the self-help things that say don't compare yourself to other people. And the truth of the matter is that we absolutely do compare ourselves to other people. And it's how we compare ourselves to other people that gets into that therapy-like understanding of how we view ourselves. We absolutely do compare ourselves to other people on very, very basic levels. Like I totally compare my Wordle scores to those of my academic friends, to bigger things like all people or all women or all men, or all academics or all students who have your degree. Gloria Anzaldúa came up with this notion of borderlands, and I really like this thought process. And she talks very particularly about Latina and Latina and Latino and Latinx identities in areas of the United States that are not Mexico, but not the United States either. And she talks about these places where our identities intersect and where we can be the most authentic. Dr. Crenshaw talks about this notion of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a really kind of very deep, heavy conversation, but on the surface level, she talks about how race and class and gender and other individualistic characteristics about ourselves all intersect with one another and overlap with one another. She talks a lot about being a Black woman and how it's very difficult to understand her as a Black person without also understanding her as a Black woman. And I like these areas where our identities intersect and overlap, almost so much so that you cannot pull them apart. Y'all, I really like the interpersonal needs theory. And this is sort of talking about our self-esteem and how it interconnects and interacts with our needs as a relational partner, and how those needs affect our communication with our relational partners. And this is all of our relational partners, not just our friends, our family, and our romantic relationships. And so this theory talks about that we have the need for control, and that we don't want too much control or too little control. We sort of want a moderate amount of control. And we also have a need for inclusion, to have positive human contact. And of course, we have the need for affection. And affection doesn't necessarily have to be the kind of affection we get from our friends and family and romantic partners, but our affection with other people as forms of interpersonal connection. If you have a particular self-concept and a particular part of your personality, then you behave and communicate in ways that projects that idea of yourself out into the world to get other people to buy it. Y'all, I think that I'm funny. I think that being funny is part of my self-concept, and so I try to tell jokes and make my students laugh. Sometimes I fail miserably, but it is part of my image management. And this is collaborative, right? If I am trying to get you to believe something about me, you have to then believe it. And if you don't, then it affects the ability or my ability to have that as part of my self-concept. Dr. Floyd talks about Dr. McAdams' work on life stories, and I think this is really kind of fascinating, and I wish I had more time to talk about it. But the other thing is that we manage multiple identities because you're playing multiple roles all of the time. And so when you're sitting in a classroom, you're trying to manage the identity of what it means to be a good student. When you're with your friends, you try to manage the identity or the image of you being a good friend or a good relational partner or a good brother or sister or a good son or daughter. And one of the interesting things that Dr. Floyd talks about in this book that I really, really wish that, again, we had more time to talk about together is this notion of people who have invisible disabilities. And how that affects their identities. And I have a friend, his name is Brian, and he wrote his dissertation on this topic. He wrote his dissertation on people who gained a disability later in life. And so they perceived themselves to not have a disability and then to have one, and how that affected their identity and their self-concept and their relationships and their communication. If you want to know more about Brian's research, come talk to me. One of the more interesting topics in this chapter is this notion of face. And face is sort of come up with or talked to by a scholar named Erving Goffman. And face is attached to image management because it is your desired public image. And face work is the things that you do to project your desired public image onto other people. And we have these needs to help us manage our face or associated with our face. And that's fellowship face, which is we have this need to feel like we're accepted by other people. And autonomy face, or some people will call it this negative face, is your need to avoid being imposed on by others. And then we have competence face, is your need to be respected and viewed as competent and intelligent. And so let me give you a couple of examples of these. Okay, hold on, back up. So face threats are any behavior that threatens one or more of your face needs. And so say you have a friend who asks you to help them move. Now, y'all, we've all done this and we're like, no. But you have the fellowship face of wanting to be perceived as a good friend, and good friends help our friends. And so, of course, you're going to help them move. On the other side, that's a threatening act against your autonomy face or your negative face, which is your need to be not imposed on by other people. Like, why would you give up a Saturday when you don't have very many of them to help somebody load their stuff into an apartment? And so that can be a face-threatening act. Or a decision that you have to make. Another really interesting one is, say you forget your best friend's birthday or an anniversary. And what that means to your face, or being seen as a good relational partner and being seen as competent. You know, self-disclosure is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And we'll talk about social penetration theory in this chapter and communication privacy management theory in a future chapter. And so self-disclosure is the act of giving people information about yourself that you believe that they do not already know or already have. And when we talk about self-disclosure, we talk about it being deliberate or intentional. And so if you accidentally blurt out something, we don't necessarily study those things as being self-disclosure. And it also must be true or true to the best of our knowledge. And so let's talk a little bit more about how we conceptualize self-disclosure, how it works in our relationships. So if you took COMM 1010 as before you took this course, and not everybody did or had to, you may remember the social penetration theory. And so we call this the onion model of self-disclosure or communication because it talks about layers. And every person has layers to their personal information. We have this very superficial layer, things like where you go to school and what's your favorite color and what's your major and how many brothers and sisters you have and what kind of music you listen to, the last book you read, those kinds of superficial things. I call these my first date topics. And then you get further into your onion and you get into the very core of us, the very things that not very many people know. And so when we talk about each individual relationship that we have, we talk about these relationships driving a wedge into our onion, right? And some people will draw a very breadth of information. So if you go on a first date and you talk for 3 hours, then that person has drawn a breadth of information from you, but maybe not a very big depth of information about you. Do you have a friend or somebody you know that when you think about it, you do not know very much about them at all? That definitely has to do with this breadth but not depth of information. Or you can have somebody who knows an extreme sort of depth of information, but not necessarily a breadth of information. Uh, and those people are kind of in our lives play a very interesting role. Um, and this happens sort of gradually, but not like super gradually, because it can happen within a few hours of each other. Um, Social penetration theory works exceptionally different online. Um, and you can see where people will post TikTok videos or Facebook statuses or Snapchats or Instagram posts that are super self-disclosure-y and super deep about their personalities and their feelings and their experiences. And it's very, very different online than it is face-to-face. We also talk about these being reciprocal, which means that if I post or I tell you a trauma story from my childhood, then maybe you will also tell me a similarly deep kind of story about yourself. And of course, the same goes for superficial reciprocation. If I tell you my favorite color is sage green, then you might also then reply with your favorite color. We know that self-disclosure is influenced by culture, both our big culture and our individual littler cultures. Any of you have parents who say, what happens in our family stays in our family? That's very much teaching you about what self-disclosure is and is not allowed within your family. It's also influenced highly by gender, where people who identify as female or feminine might be seen as having more self-disclosure than people who are seen as male or masculine. This is one of the many critiques, or several of the critiques about social penetration theory, and this is not in your textbook. And my favorite topic is this sort of bottom point of that we don't necessarily reveal ourselves, but we are constructing ourselves interpersonally, and that even in the act of telling things about ourselves to other people, we are co-creating meaning with that other person. And I talked about this a lot when I talked about my dissertation participants, that telling their story in that moment helped them create their identity around what it meant to be a birth mother. There are lots of critiques of social penetration theory, but I still really like it as a way to understand self-disclosure, but I like communication privacy management theory more, and we'll talk about that later this semester. If you've ever worked in a service industry, you have probably had a customer that randomly told you some very, very intimate details about their lives for no reason. And that's one of the things that we like to call painful self-disclosures. And they're really common. It's sort of super fascinating. My husband works in a pharmacy, and he gets lots of these all of the time. And I find them kind of really interesting. But there are lots of benefits to self-disclosure, right? It increases intimacy with other people when we start to tell them things that are deeper about ourselves. It creates trust in relationships. If I tell you something about myself, I trust you to be kind and to handle that information in a specific way. And it's an emotional release. There's lots of risks to self-disclosure, right? There's a big risk of being hurt or having that information used against you. There's a risk of rejection. there is a risk of being imposed on to reciprocate that kind of information. And then, of course, things like self-disclosure online doesn't ever go away, and it could come back to hurt you later.